The average age of a soldier in Vietnam was 19 years old. In World War II it was 26. These weren't hardened men, they were teenagers. High school graduates got their draft notice in June and were in the jungle by September. Many had never been away from home. They couldn't legally drink, but they could carry an M16. 58,000 died before they turned 25. The boomers who came home weren't kids anymore. They'd seen things no teenager should see, and America never said thank you. You've probably heard that number before, 19. It's the figure everyone repeats, the one that made this story famous in the first place. But if you look closely at the actual military records, that number doesn't quite hold up. The real average was closer to 22. Historians trace the 19 figure back to a 1985 song, not to official data. Here's the thing though, that correction doesn't make this story less true, it makes it more true. Because 22 isn't some grizzled veteran either. 22 is barely out of his teens, barely 2 or 3 years removed from a high school hallway. The number changes. The story underneath it doesn't. This happened to hundreds of thousands of young men across America. Not soldiers by choice or calling, but by a slip of paper that arrived in June and rearranged the rest of their lives without asking permission. This is their story. Not the politics, not the protests, not the arguments still being had decades later. Just the boys who went, who came home changed, and who this country never quite found the right words at the right time to properly thank. Before the draft notice, these were just teenagers living entirely ordinary lives. Friday night football under stadium lights, summer jobs at gas stations saving for a used car, girlfriends, first jobs, vague plans about what came next, college maybe, or a trade, or following a father into the family business. Nothing about their daily lives suggested that within months they'd be holding a weapon instead of a diploma. A young man could graduate high school in June, receive his draft notice within weeks, and be in a combat zone before the school year that would have been his freshman year of college even started. There was no gradual transition, no slow build toward adulthood the way it happens for most people. It was immediate. One version of his life ended in a matter of weeks, and an entirely different one began. Here's something else worth knowing, something that reframes this story further. It wasn't the whole generation. Less than 10% of baby boomers actually served in Vietnam. The draft only applied to men born roughly between 1946 and 1957. Anyone born later turned 18, after the draft had already ended. And even among those eligible, only a fraction went. This wasn't a shared generational experience carried by millions together. It was a burden carried by a relatively small number of young men, which makes the silence that followed even harder to sit with. They didn't just come home to a country that didn't fully acknowledge them. In many cases, they came home to a generation of their own peers who had never gone at all, and didn't fully understand what had happened to the ones who had. That gap, between what they were legally considered capable of at home and what they were asked to do overseas alone, as a minority within their own generation, sits at the centre of everything that follows. What they walked into was almost impossible to prepare for. Dense jungle terrain, extreme heat, monsoon seasons that turned the ground to mud for weeks, an environment that was as much an opponent as the war itself. Many had grown up in suburban neighbourhoods or small towns. Nothing in their upbringing prepared them for this. The nature of the conflict made it worse. No clear front line, danger from any direction, often invisible until it was too late. No safe rear area, no place to exhale. The tension didn't lift when the fighting paused, it simply waited. For a young man barely into his 20s, the psychological toll was enormous. He was facing life and death decisions, the deaths of close friends, sustained fear, at an age when most of his peers back home were worrying about final exams. Letters became his only connection to the world he'd left, delayed weeks, arriving out of order, a painful thread back to a life that felt further away every day. He matured, by necessity, faster than anyone should have to. Responsibility for his own life and the lives of the men beside him landed on shoulders that, months earlier, had been carrying a backpack to class. Many veterans have described feeling within a few months in country as though they'd aged years, not physically, but in what they now understood about the world and about themselves. Not all of them made it home. 58,000 American service members died in Vietnam, and the overwhelming majority were, like the ones who survived, still very young. 58,000 is a number large enough to become an abstraction, so it's worth pausing on what it actually represents. 58,000 individual young men, each with a name, a hometown, a family that received a visit no family wants to receive. 58,000 futures, careers never started, families never had, cut short before most of them turned 25. Some died in engagements that would later be studied and written about. Many more died in smaller moments that never made headlines. A patrol that went wrong, an ambush no map fully captured. Each name now etched into a black granite wall in Washington, D.C. was, not long before, a teenager or a very young man sitting in a classroom like anyone else. Their families lived through their own ordeal, the waiting, the dread of a knock at the door, the grief of losing a child sent somewhere they couldn't have found on a map a year earlier. For many, that loss was compounded later by a country that seemed reluctant to fully reckon with what it had asked and what it had cost. For those who survived and returned, the parade so many Americans picture from earlier wars, the crowd, the visible public gratitude, largely did not happen for Vietnam veterans. Many came home not to celebration, but to a country deeply divided over the war, a divide that spilled over into how they personally were treated. Some faced open hostility. Far more faced something quieter and just as painful: indifference. A sense that the country wanted to move past the war, and in doing so move past the people who had fought it. Veterans returned changed in ways their families weren't equipped to understand. What we now recognise as post-traumatic stress was, at the time, poorly understood, rarely diagnosed, almost never adequately treated. Many carried that weight largely alone, expected to simply reintegrate, get a job, move forward, without the kind of support that could have actually helped. There was no unified national moment of thanks, and because so few of their own peers had shared the experience, many veterans found that even their own generation didn't fully grasp what they'd carried home. That gap between what was given so young and by so few and what was returned in recognition is the emotional centre of this story. None of this can be undone. The years taken can't be returned, and the ones who didn't come home can't be brought back. But something can still be said, even now. If you served, in Vietnam, or in any conflict where you went as barely more than a kid and came home changed, thank you. Not as a formality, but as something this country owed you a long time ago, and, for too long, didn't fully give. If you're the child, grandchild, or friend of someone who served, someone who may never have talked about it, this is for him too, for the version of him that was young and far from home, and for the man he became because of it. And if you lost someone, a brother, a father, a friend who never came home, his name deserves to be spoken even now. He was somebody's son. That matters, and it should be said out loud. This country was slow to say thank you. Some would say it still hasn't fully said it. So let this be a small part of that. Late, but not too late. If this brought back a memory, a name, a face, tell us in the comments. Say his name if you want to.